So with that, I'm going to turn you over to the first portion of the show and turn you over to the capable hands of Eric Fritzius.
Howdy. I'm Eric, you guys know me. We have a number of readers tonight and presenters and storytellers. It's not all going to be reading, it's going to be a variety of different things, including, I believe, song. And the very first person on our list is a man named Larry Staats. Larry is a retired attorney currently living in Columbus, Ohio. And since I'm the spouse of a physician, I think I'm supposed to make some sort of snide comment at this point. But because he's retired, I'll let it live. Larry does old-time Appalachian storytelling, often accompanied by percussive dance and instruments. And he says he entered the storytelling game with a goal of at least entertaining himself, and if others are entertained, then that's just collateral damage. Larry Staats.
Okay, this evening is, in fact, this weekend is supposed to be educational, as I understand it. So I have a musical instrument here, and who knows what it is? Well, looks like you're going to learn something then, but it's called a nose flute. And see, you're now laughing. It's an instrument that gets no respect. No respect at all. And of course, being a nose flute, it's played by the nose, but this is a concert quality nose flute. It's no ordinary nose flute. It's the same nose flute that's played in the nose flute section of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. That's right. That's right. That's right. So we will play you a little tune here to get started. Now, some musicians play by ear, and I've tried that, but it doesn't work. So I play by nose. That's what I have. We're going to try some here. When the Saints go marching in, I've never done it holding a mic, but we'll try it. Well, tonight, I want to talk to you about recycling. That's a big thing going on these days, you know. In fact, right out here on the porch, there's containers to put different kind of cans and bottles and things like that. But I grew up in Sandyville, here in Jackson County, about 10 miles north of here on US 21. And back in those days, that's a long time ago, we were just coming out of the Great Depression. And then World War II came along. And it's rationing in World War II, and boy, times were really tough for people around Sandyville. And everybody recycled. We didn't have no choice. We had to recycle just to get along. And some of the people there were really good at recycling. And some of them may have carried it to extreme. And I'm thinking about Kenny and Emma. And they were an old couple. Now, I grew up with my grandma and grandpa. And my grandma and grandpa both used snuff, honest, square snuff. But Kenny and Emma, they weren't quite so refined. They chewed tobacco. Plain old tobacco, you know. And it was red man tobacco. It came in a tin foil poker. You ever seen that? Yeah. And the way they did it was they would hold that poke open, and they would take two fingers on their hand, right hand, and their thumb, and they'd stick it down in that poke, and they would grab as much tobacco as they could get. And then they'd tilt their head back and cram that tobacco right down in their mouth, like that. And then they'd waller it around in their mouth until it became good. And then they would take that hood and push it past their teeth out in their jaw and park it there until they needed to chew it some more, you know. Well, what they would do was every morning after breakfast, they would get themselves a big chew of tobacco. And they would chew that tobacco all day And just before supper, well, they would take it out and put it in front of the fire to dry out. And then after supper, after it dried out, they'd get their pipes. Now, both of them smoked a pipe. And they would put that dried out good of tobacco in the pipes. And then they would take a kitchen match. You ever see these old guys strike a kitchen match? Now, the men would do it like Kenny. You got to raise your leg like that. Make your pants tight across your butt. And you go like that. You do that. No, you don't do that. Anyway, they smoked their pipe. And they would smoke their pipe until that tobacco was all just ashes. And then they would, no, I can't do that this way. Knock those ashes out of the pipes into their hand. And then they would take their finger and they would stir those ashes around in the palm of their hand until they were a fine powder, you know, just like snuff. And then they would take that ground up ashes, and to get the last bit of nicotine out of it, they would snuff it up their nose. And then they would take a rag about this big, and they would blow their nose into that rag. And then they would polish your shoes with the rag. Now, folks, that's recycling. And I thank you for your patience and your attention.
Our next person of the evening, next writer of the evening, is a Morgantown writer named Daleen Berry. When not simultaneously writing 2 books while single-handedly running a small indie publishing company, Daleen enjoys reading a good book. She also writes occasional newspaper articles, and today she's going to grace us with one called Ashes to Ashes, Urns to Trunks, Dad in Limbo, which took 2nd place at the Maryland, Delaware, DC newspaper competition. Daleen Berry.
Originally, I was going to do some improv myself, but I had a splitting headache and I just was not up to the energy. So I brought my laptop with a column in it. That's why you don't see paper. Okay, true story. My father lives in a solid square box. He's been there for 8 years. Although, given his condition, I don't think lives is the right verb, because he's dead. So instead, I should say my father's remains remain in a lovely, expensive marble urn my sister bought. They've been there since Dad returned from a medical school somewhere in Texas, having shown in death a generosity many people might not ever show in life when he donated his body to medical science. Now, at first, my mother placed him on the fireplace mantle. Then she began taking him along in the car, on the outings of mine, all the while joking that Dale was enjoying the family's dinner, or he was getting tired and wanted to go home. Eventually, Dad did come to have a semi-permanent resting place. I wonder what he would think if he knew his ashes sit somewhere in another sister's house, awaiting burial in the family plot down in Jackson County. Some family members might disagree with me, but I think he'd get a kick out of it. Pop a top off another can of Coors, put pen, rarely a pencil, to a crossword puzzle, and just grin. I believe this because I remember the long empty pine box that sat inside our garage in the backyard, next to one of his 2 beloved MGs, which he kept meaning to get around to restoring, reviving the luster of years gone by. "You can just put me in the box and bury me out back, Eileen," he would grin, joking with my mother about his intended casket. Truth be told, he wouldn't have cared one whit if she had done just that. And that's why I know he wouldn't mind that we haven't gotten around to burying him yet. Now, it isn't that we haven't wanted to. It isn't that there hasn't been the time. It's just that, well, how can I say this diplomatically? The relatives waged war about how he was to be buried. Not where, just under what conditions. To have or not have a minister. Franklin D. Roosevelt was probably president the last time my father stepped foot inside a church. To have or not have a flag, military caps, and an entire tribute. A Navy man, he fought in the Korean War, Korean conflict. To have or not have a burial service. Now, my mom and I believed his last wish was to have just a simple burial without pomp and circumstance of any kind. With his love of flight and ever-piloted heart, we really thought he might have enjoyed having his ashes sprinkled from an airplane somewhere over West Virginia. In fact, he had once told us as much. But other family members wanted all the pomp and circumstance that could be had. So Mother Stonewall was waiting for the family to come to terms with what she believed were Dad's last wishes, which he had, after all, related to her before he died. And somehow, in the meantime, 8 years had passed. We were supposed to bury him a few years ago, but something happened. Then again last year, but that didn't work either. Now, here it is, 2007. So why not just wait another 2 years, and we can have some kind of an anniversary in reverse? My father's ashes are not the only ones that have remained as, well, remains. I've been compiling a list of similar cases, and I think I may have enough to make for some really good reading. Except that West Virginia author Belinda Anderson already beat me to it. 2 years ago, I met Anderson at a writer's workshop. I was surprised when she began discussing one of her short stories about a character who drives around with her dead sister's ashes in the trunk. It's fiction, but I'd be willing to bet that Anderson based her story on a real-life scenario somewhere. It could have been, she knows my friends Vicki and Dan, who related a true story of their own several years ago. Now, Dan's an ace mechanic. He was working on a client's Volkswagen when he accidentally knocked over a container inside. He spilled out what he thought was sand. Dan, good soul that he is, scooped up what he could and then vacuumed up the rest. Turns out what Dan really vacuumed was the woman's deceased husband. She had been carting him around for years. The woman told Dan her husband never liked Volkswagens. So Vicki and Dan think maybe she kept him around as poetic justice, forcing him to ride in the car that he probably turned his nose up to when he was alive. I guess she showed him. Then there's a story about my dear friend Shirley. She died in 2000, and her husband has yet to pick up her remains from the mortuary. Now, being the romantic fool I am, I thought he was just so overcome by grief, he couldn't bear to bury her. Turns out his reason was much more pragmatic. You see, he'd given the mortician a bid for some contrasting work, but the mortician had gone with a lower bidder. No harm, no foul, right? I guess it depends on your perspective. As my friend's husband explained, he lost money by not getting the job, so he left both his wife's ashes and the unpaid bill there at the funeral home. That's the truth, which I'll swear to on my father's urn. Now, I once wanted to be cremated, but in the last 8 years, I think I've changed my mind. Because after hearing so many stories about the ashes of the deceased, how, where, why they end up in a state of limbo, dead but not really gone, I guess you could say, I think I'm going to settle for a funeral. At least then, I won't end up riding around in someone's trunk.